The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Happy Tuesday, everyone. We'll be starting in about 5 minutes. Good morning, everyone. We'll be starting in about a minute. All right. Good morning and good afternoon to those on the East Coast, everyone. And thanks once again for joining the PartsTrader Industry Update. I'm your host, Greg Horn. We've got a good action-packed presentation for you today. And as usual, we'll finish up and then have some time for Q&A. So just type your questions into the questions pane over on the right. And without further ado, let's get started. So we're going to start with an automotive news update. Now, the one thing I always like to take a look at over the years, and they've just S&P Global Mobility has just published the average age of a vehicle on the road in the U.S. by vehicle type. And you can see that the passenger car versus light truck and versus the average has really expanded. So it's 13.1 years from new for the average light passenger vehicle, a passenger car. Now, you got to say, okay, well, why did it separate from 2016 to 2022? What was the big difference in the last 6 years? Really, we have to look at what the difference was in new vehicle purchasing by the American public. We are, of course, in love with our light trucks and SUVs, and we buy them over passenger cars. Ford realized that lesson a few years ago by discontinuing virtually every passenger car they made, other than the Mustang, and we'll call the Mach-E kind of an SUV crossover. But you can see that the tastes have really gone towards these light trucks and SUVs. And when we look at it in the insurance and vehicle repair business, the really interesting thing is that SUVs on a whole in the average collision take about 1.2 more parts per vehicle to repair than does the standard passenger car, mainly because of the difference in bumper systems and other components. So as we look either from a collision repair shop perspective or from an insurance company perspective at the numbers of parts, it's important to look at the vehicle mix, passenger car versus truck versus SUV as well, because that'll give us some insights, even though we know there is some seasonality to parts purchasing, the average number of parts replaced per RO. The type of vehicle also drives that number. Now, the interesting thing too is we're seeing as a byproduct of these low US new vehicle sales, we're seeing some really high mile used cars coming through not just on the corner buy here, pay here lot, but also at dealership lots. To give you an example, about a month ago, I looked at a couple of different lots across the US, and I saw the used car inventory at Longo Toyota in El Monte, California. One of the reasons that dealership is especially famous is they have the largest Toyota body shop in the US. I think it's 28 or 30 stalls, big body shop. They have a significant number of very high mileage cars on their lot, including an '08 Corolla up top with 195,000 miles, an Infiniti with 196, that Prius in the middle with 360,000 miles. Not to be left out, Ed Napleton Ed Napleton Chevrolet in Columbus, Wisconsin had a 2013 Chevy Tahoe with 313,000 miles on it. You can see it's Carfax certified, so that must have the longest Carfax history known to man. The reason behind that is obviously there's a lack of new cars and the people's ability to purchase a new vehicle. We're going to talk about the average transaction price of a new car. It's reached record highs again. But as we know from the previous slide, the average age of a vehicle on the road is 12.2 years. Vehicles are lasting longer. And it's just that the older vehicles retain their value. We've seen a big jump in used car prices, roughly about 40%. And there's that normal thing that people are buying those off-lease vehicles. Well, those are also going for a premium. So it's pushing people with lower price points into significantly older, higher mile vehicles. And I thought the only upside of this could be that you won't be getting a call from those folks trying to talk to you about your vehicle's extended warranty. But I found out that CarShield offers in their CarShield Gold program a warranty, an extended warranty that you can purchase for a vehicle with 300,000 miles or less. So there are a couple on here in our examples that would actually still be eligible for a warranty, which is really scary. And of course, they don't tell you how much the warranty is going to cost or how much it covers. but it's going to be offered. The other odd thing is that we're seeing these vehicles still being financed. And as we see that market start to erode, as we get back in 2023 more towards regular vehicle pricing and regular new vehicle build back in that 17 million annual sales goal, uh, these vehicles that are super high miles, that are financed, are going to be really, really upside down and make them a complete nightmare to settle a total loss should that occur. Switching a little bit to BMW. BMW has announced they're going to challenge Tesla's grip on luxury EVs. They said that they aim to sell 200,000 units globally this year, more than double what it delivered last year. But so far, Tesla has edged out BMW in the luxury market by a wide margin, 33,000 units, or as a percentage in the first half of the year or the first quarter of the year, they sold 41% more EVs than did BMW. BMW registrations actually fell by 3.4%. So they're having a little bit of an issue. Now, the interesting thing is if you look over here on the right, that picture is one of their full EVs, and you can see by the reflection of that grille, um, there is no need for that big of a grille on a BMW. It's merely a styling cue. Um, and I don't know about you, it's a matter of taste, but man, these things are getting out of hand. And so I look at BMW styling over the years and their kidney grill, and it just seems to be getting bigger, almost to the point where we're going to see something like this in 2060. It just drives me nuts. The other thing that drives me nuts is that BMW is starting to sell heated seat subscriptions for $18 a month in other markets other than the US. So you can buy them for a year subscription, heated seats, $180, or for 3 years, or pay for unlimited access. Now, the interesting thing is that feature is also part of the build cost of the car. So you're buying it, but to merely have it activated is going to cost you an additional fee. That is something that I fear they are treading on some dangerous ground. Now, it's in place in the UK, Germany, New Zealand, and South Africa. I don't know the need for heated seats in South Africa, but I may be wrong. Um, it's not an option, but BMW is looking at what they call microtransactions on features such as auto dimming headlights and adaptive cruise. And I scratch my head and I say, okay, so how does this work? You have the adaptive cruise control one day and your subscription expires. Do you push the button that says not available, please resubscribe? Same thing with auto dimming headlights. That one is a little bit odd to me because you look at the auto dimming headlights, one day it works, one day it doesn't. You're going to have some pretty ticked off people if your auto dimming headlights stop working. Another thing, not to pick on BMW, but I will, is we saw a case, interestingly, in California where a man is suing BMW Finance saying that they incorrectly kept $25,000 in equity owed him after he had his 2019 M5 competition totaled. So it's a plaintiff named Alexander Russell. Um, and he filed a lawsuit in the Central District of California. Um, and he believes that the class could reach well over 1,000 people. He took out a 36-month lease on a 115,000 BMW in October of 2019. In February 2022, he was involved in an accident which totaled the vehicle. Safeco, his insurance company, and my one-time employer, determined the value to be 106,178, and his residual on his finance for his lease was 81,000. Now, somehow Safeco sent BMW Finance the entire check for 106,000, and they're intent on keeping it. Now, obviously, if the vehicle has a residual that's stated 81,000, I don't see what legal ground they have to stand on. But despite his pleas, they are keeping that money so far. This is really going to be interesting. Um, as we look at other news, we see the average profit sales price, the average transaction price of new vehicles sold by dealers to retail customers in June of this year hit a record 45,844. That's up 14.5% from just a year ago. And that is truly those dealers able to charge over retail because of the low supply and high demand. To give you an idea, in normal times, we have about 3 to 4 million units across the US in the pipeline for new vehicle sales. For the last 8 months, that level has been below 900,000 units, which is really, really scary. And that's what's driving these record profit taking on a transactional basis. So the total gross profit of vehicle delivered jumped to a record of $5,100. So this is really, really interesting that the average per vehicle gross is over 2.5 times what it was during pre-pandemic normal 2019 time periods. So dealerships are not suffering too badly. They're getting a lot of throughput. They're getting a lot of profit for sales. Even though the number of sales is down, they're still raking in some pretty amazing profits. And we're going to switch into a new feature that we call Recall Roundup, because there are several recalls out that I've looked at lately that influence or could be impacted by a claim, or could be a claim that is actually covered by a manufacturer defect recall. We saw a record number of recall campaigns in 2021, but vehicles impacted. So we saw 406 recalls so far in 2021. And that's compared to 317 in 2020. But the number of vehicles impacted was actually lower by about 7 million vehicles. So more recalls, but again, fewer overall vehicles impacted. The first one we're going to look at is the Honda Ridgeline, and there's a fire risk, and it is really interesting. They've recalled 112,000 vehicles in the US because of a frame strap defect. Now, this is the 2006 to 2014 Honda Ridgeline that were sold or ever registered in what NHTSA calls the Salt Belt region of the country, indicating that the de-icing agent, salt, road salt, can impact and rust through the tank straps, causing the tank to drop and either get a puncture or separate from the filler neck and spill gasoline all over that hot fuel or the hot exhaust. Now, the really interesting thing is that NHTSA actually has a formal definition of salt belt states, and this is what's really interesting. This is actually an excerpt from that recall. Now, they call the salt belt region, you can see the states listed here, but really interesting, there's some states that are absent. Nebraska. It snows a heck of a lot in Nebraska, and yet that's not on. They use road salt. Same with Kansas. Missouri's on there. So apparently, if you registered your car in Kansas City, Missouri, you're eligible for that recall. But if the vehicle's registered in Kansas City, Kansas, you're not. Really, really interesting. The Dakota's completely left off of this recall. But those are some interesting things. So if you do actually have a claim of a fire, which would potentially result in one of those vehicles being damaged to the point of total loss, it would be interesting to see if that was caused actually by the straps corroding and breaking. Another interesting thing, this goes back, we first saw Dakota airbag, the recall, become a problem, and it has still gone over a decade. Back in 2011 and 2012, we first saw the initial recalls involving a Takata airbag, but this is an interesting twist. Eklund Ford of Richwood, Texas, and Ford Motor Company proper are being sued for not replacing a passenger side airbag. They replaced the driver's side, but they did not replace the passenger side bag inflator during the recall. So the folks that own this Mustang believed that they were in compliance with the recalled airbag, that the vehicle was safe. But this vehicle was involved in an accident where the bags deployed. That unfortunate passenger, because of the shrapnel released by the defective inflator, lost an eye and received some pretty severe facial lacerations. Now, Ford recalled more than 58,000, little typo there, of their Ford vehicles, including this 2007 Mustang. And we all know that more than 67 million airbags were impacted by the Takata recall, and Takata declared bankruptcy because they were unable to complete the recalls and still stay solvent. So the Takata airbag issue is still ongoing. As we see claims coming in for injuries, we've got to make sure and look at that recall history to see if both sides of those airbags were done. Over 19 deaths and more than 400 injuries have been linked to these defective airbags over time. And I unfortunately see that we're going to still experience more deaths than injuries because of the improper recall or lack of a recall on these vehicles. Also on the subject of exploding interior components, Hyundai North America is recalling 281,000 vehicles, Elantras and Accents in the North American market because they're belt pretensioners. Now, the belt pretensioners, it's a thermo explosion that tightens the belt in the event of an imminent crash. They are seeing that 3 people have been injured from these over powerful deployments of the pretensioners and causing plastic shards to hit the people involved in those accidents. So that's another pretty large recall for Hyundai Motor USA. Switching gears a little bit and looking at the impact of the war in Ukraine, you know, that has kind of fallen out of headlines recently, but it is still an ongoing issue for the automotive industry. Now, we've talked before about wiring harnesses and how Western Ukraine was always an attractive place for making wiring harnesses because it's fairly labor intensive, low labor costs, lot of good transportation links to assembly plants throughout Europe. We also know that they made royal gases like neon. They make minerals like platinum and palladium, which are used in catalytic converters. Those are big things. But the other thing we haven't talked about is a material called carbon black. And the surprising thing about carbon black is 30% of the European production of carbon black comes from Russia, Belarus, or the Ukraine. Now, that material is made in tires. It improves the strength, performance, and durability of tires, as well as battery cases, wiring, and other cables. That is a pretty interesting thing because as you look at European manufactured tires like Pirelli, Michelin, Falcon, and the rest, Continental, you do see actually an increase of replacement tires, and that is due to the shortage and the overall rising cost of carbon black. And as always, we do an update on the Port of Los Angeles, so we'll give you the latest and greatest. Although there are still rail delays, Burlington Northern Santa Fe still says that they are experiencing some side yard storage delays that prohibit the timely return of empty rail cars back to the Port of Long Beach, Port of Los Angeles. The throughput level, the dwell time of containers at the Port of Los Angeles have returned to near normal levels. So the throughput is still there. Now, once they get off of the Port of Los Angeles, we see those delays of the rail sidings and some other delays. But the throughput at the port has returned to normal, which is really good news. The other interesting thing and the thing to watch as we go forward is on June 30th, the collective bargaining agreement for the International Longshoremen Workers Union expired, including the no strike clause. The interesting thing is that the 22,400 longshoremen affected by this could walk off the job. If they did, 47% of all containers arriving from Asia would not be able to be unloaded. That is a huge deal. Now, Gene Soroka, who we reported on before, who's the director or the executive director of the Port of Los Angeles, indicated while anything's possible, he doesn't see the ILWU workers walking off the job. But man, if there was ever leverage for a union It's the fact that 47% of the containers coming from Asia would be impacted. That's some leverage. So we're going to take a look and watch those developments, because that again has impacts to not only the aftermarket but also to the OE parts coming from Asian markets. As we look at parts inflation and cycle time, we're going to take a little bit of our normal look at the median and average cycle time of parts ordered in our system, but also I wanted to take a look at parts inflation and give you a really interesting look overall at what we see in 2022 through June, split out by part type. So this is the average part price per part type by in 2020, 2021, and so far through June, end of June in 2022. Starting from the top, we're looking at remanufactured and reconditioned. And really what we see when we look at the spike in prices, it really does just mirror the absence of technicians able to do the remanufacturing of wheels. You can see it spike during the big part of the lockdown, and you can start to see it sort of gradually increase. And we've heard from all of the wheel manufacturers, Transwheel, et cetera, that it is really tough for them to get qualified technicians in and turning those remanufacturing of those damaged cores back and putting them back into the market. So we have seen a pretty significant increase. The other thing is we've seen a stabilizing in 2022 so far of recycled parts. So we're getting the sort of normal market forces back in force, and we're seeing a stabilization of recycled prices, which is a good thing. As we look at the next category, which is OEM surplus, we've seen this is the only category where the average transaction price, the list price, has gone down. Now, that could be several factors, but I truly believe it's because of the supply. The number of parts that are in the OEM surplus have deteriorated. They've reduced, so that the larger parts, the surplus hoods, the surplus bumper covers, etc., have disappeared from that surplus supply, and it's more of these smaller components that are being sold, which is the reason the average transaction price has been decreasing over time. As we look at the next one, which is OEM new, we see that has been surprisingly stable. And the really interesting thing is, as we look at aftermarket parts, because of their tight link to the OE as far as retail pricing, we track those two very, very closely. And you can see by looking at the 2022 chart that the aftermarket has gone within $3 of the OE. And you say, that is the increase in average price of aftermarket. And I would say that I would issue some caution on that conclusion there. And the reason I say that is because we have seen a shortage of supply on the OE side of larger components like bumper covers, like hoods, like fenders, and the transaction price of those components is actually very high. So as we see the shortage, the inability to supply them on the OE side, we see repairers selecting the aftermarket for quicker delivery or fulfilling that lack of supply on the OE side. So I think rather than pricing action, it is more the vehicle mix in that equation over these last few months, especially from April till now. So we can see that we're starting to see sort of a stabilization of prices overall, with the exception of the remanufactured component, and really looking that when it comes to recon, that is about the only part type out there is that remanufactured alloy wheel. So we're looking and we're seeing a shift of good used wheels when available, taking the place of the remanufactured unit higher because of the lack of the core available, but we'll see if that helps stabilize pricing overall. Now, as promised, we're going to look at the median delivery time, and again, a primer for those folks who are new to these charts. Going from the upper left, we look at the gray bar chart. That is the median plus 2 standard deviations. That's capturing 95% of the delivery days population for all part types in this chart. And we can see that the outliers, so this is the outliers, take as long as 13.8 days in July. Now that is down pretty significantly, almost a full day from the previous months. So we're starting to see, if you look at the trend from February on, we start to see an overall downward trend in those outliers. And to put that another way, to say, you know, the average estimate, say, has 11 parts, you'd get 10 of those parts in 2 days, super, but that one part you're waiting on is that outlier, and that has a median delivery of about 13.8 days for 95% of the population. We track that because when we look at just the average, it dilutes the impact of those outliers. So we want to show both the average, which is the blue bar, and you can see that that's just at 2 days again, which is sort of the normal average overall for the throughput for all part types. But we see a reduction in those outliers. Looking over on the upper right, we see the standard deviation by vehicle make, and what we see here is 4 nameplates and 3 manufacturers. So we see delays with Honda and Acura. We see delays, particularly brutal delays with Mazda and with Mitsubishi. But we see Acura sort of leading the pack, unfortunately, at 27.3 days. Going to the heat map of the US, we see delays are most common in South Dakota, a little bit in North Dakota, and also in Arizona. As we switch to the OEM new, this is truly what's driving those outliers. You can see, again, the overall trend of those outliers is down to 15.2 days, which is great. We do see the average bump back up from what was just over a day in April and May, back up to just at under 2 days average delivery time. We see that the usual suspects of Honda, Acura, Mazda, and Mitsubishi are still causing those delays. As we look at the aftermarket, we see a very standard, with the exception of February. And again, you got to look at the scale here. We were thinking, you know, in the teens as far as median delivery days before, and we're seeing with the aftermarket 1.6 to 1.7 pretty consistently as the median, and the average, again, that blue bar, is just at 1. So pretty good supply, but again, it's a little bit of adverse selection because of the limited number of SKUs, and high volume parts is going to drive a completely different equation when it comes to cycle time of delivery days. The outliers broken out by vehicle is Acura, and the vertical bar, it's too small to put in the name Buick, but that is for Buick vehicles. We can see that South Dakota comes out on the short end of the stick again, unfortunately. Now let's go to the recycled, and we see an interesting thing. In July, we did see an uptick from 2 to 3 days, or just at 3 days for the average cycle time. The median, including those outliers, actually reduced. So that's still pretty healthy. We see a little bit of delays, 4.2 days for Honda salvage parts, Mitsubishi still as the outlier, and unfortunately South Dakota as the big outlier. Okay, that concludes the portion, and we'll go into our question and answer period, and I'm going to read a couple of questions. Bob, good morning, Bob, says, good morning and thanks for the presentation. Thanks for listening, Bob. Do you know what the manufacturers plan to do with all the vehicles that are built but unable to sell due to lack of chips? Will a 2020 be sold as a new vehicle in 2024. Thank you. Now, my understanding with the delays, and we've saw pictures of the Kentucky Motor Speedway, and we see Broncos still awaiting some chips. Those VIN stamps are VIN stamped according to year, and so those will be sold as the appropriate build model year. They will be sold as a new vehicle, but will be sold as a 2021 model year, for example, but sold in 2022 or even 2023. Now, the interesting thing is that the warranties for most manufacturers will take place from the initial date of service. So if you have a 5-year 60,000, it would be that 2023 in-service date would drive the warranty. Now, I think that you won't see any significant pricing reductions for buying that 2-year-old new vehicle. That'll be interesting as things return to normal in the future, because you still would have, say 2027, you'd have a 7-year-old vehicle that has only been in service for 5 days or for 5 years. So interesting, but it truly goes back to the VIN plate manufacturing, and that's what drives it. But the warranties will be from in-service date. My good friend Ray says, for the LA ports, any news on the rail workers strike or truckers potential strike? CAAB 5 updates. I did read something over the weekend that the rail workers are looking to expand a strike potential, which is scary, and that's still going to limit our delivery of those containers coming off of the ports. Tony Maringo has said, for the recon wheels going up in price, could that also be due to manufacturers not allowing their vehicles to be repaired? That has always sort of been an underlying theme. When I was at General Motors, the official GM stance was that they were not allowed to be remanufactured if they even took less than 0.5 millimeter off of the material, so no reduction in material was appropriate. Now, that was the GM stance, and yet the GM dealers were remanufacturing wheels to put those vehicles on the used car market all day long. So I don't think that there's, unless the requirement is to order a new wheel and return that damaged wheel as core in order to get that new wheel, that's the only way that the OE manufacturers can truly control that supply. And I have an anonymous question. I love these. Have you seen many suppliers introduce additional delivery charges, fuel surcharges, to combat rising costs? The answer is yes. Now, the interesting thing is, remember in the PartsTrader system, when you place that bid is all inclusive. So it includes delivery charges. So when the bid is put on the marketplace and is accepted by a repairer, that is the final price, and we control very, very stringently any sort of sleight of hand by a supplier trying to introduce a cost over and above what was agreed to in the marketplace. Bill has asked a question regarding recalls. Is any effort underway to allow aftermarket shops to repair recalls? The interesting thing is that that has happened in the past when General Motors in the late 80s, early 90s had horrific paint problems. There was a lack of ability of dealer service departments, paint departments to do that, and they were farming out that work. So there is a precedent that the OEs would pay an independent aftermarket shop to do those body shop type repairs. Don't know yet about on the mechanical side, but it's very, very possible. Bill Roble also follows up with any insight regarding South Dakota parts delivery delays, and the answer is yes. What really it is it's driven by the delivery from Nebraska, Iowa, and Minnesota shops into that South Dakota market. They will hit the border cities, so they will go to Fargo, but it's really some of the sort of mid and towards that western part of South Dakota, you can see we have a marketplace gap in Montana and Wyoming, and it's truly driven by the lack of suppliers in those areas. So that really drives that overall piece of it. Nick, yes, it says, "Hi, Greg. Sounds like you really love BMWs. I am a former BMW owner. I since got better." And it says, "How do you think HELA Tier 1 certification will be viewed when a new BMW requires a replacement headlight? Do you think that those units will be favored by shops in the same way OEM dealer parts with the BMW logo is stamped on the box?" The interesting thing is those Tier 1s supplied by HELA and some of the manufacturers supply Bosch, Vallejo, do manufacture the identical unit with the exception they're coming from the same production lines, with the exception of that stamped BMW logo. Now, that is really up to the vehicle owner if they're going to accept logo on one side and lack of a logo on the other side, or do they find such a cost savings that it's a cost advantage to replace both headlamps with that non-logoed tier 1 unit? Very, very possible that the owner would accept that. And look forward to following up that conversation, Nick. Lee Fraser asks, "Recently we've been receiving claims for exploding sunroofs. Any recalls that you have heard about on this front?" That is, that it comes from the lack of rigidity and severe body flex that places a lot of pressure on those large glass panels. When you have a panoramic sunroof and you have a significant amount of vehicle flex, that is usually, if you can show that there was no other falling rock, any sort of thing striking that glass panel, that it was caused by vehicle flex, that's where you can go after the manufacturer for that defect slash if there was a recall. That is tough to prove because the manufacturer is well positioned to say, nope, we don't know of anything. And it must have been some stone that we no longer see on the interior, what have you, something struck that, causing that panel to explode. But Lee, I have seen that, hearkening back to my General Motors days again, at the launch of the C5 Corvette, we would see on the convertible units a significant amount of body flex that would actually shatter the windshield when the owner drove his vehicle into an angled driveway. So not uncommon, it happens, and it is truly an engineering defect, but the really difficult thing is proving that. Got a question from Madhu saying, "How is Hollander part interchange? How is it working on accuracy?" That is an interesting multi-tiered question. I believe that Hollander is ripe for increasing its parts reach and improving its accuracy. When an aftermarket part is bid, we do have in PartsTrader a series of Hollander clarification questions, but it truly does go back to the fact that the initial part is identified by the Hollander interchange. There is a need for a revamping and an expansion of the Hollander interchange. But that has to go back to Solera and their appetite to invest in that product. That is a backbone of the U.S. collision industry, and I think it's ripe for some improvements. All right. I still see we have some more questions. At least my light here is blinking. But I really appreciate everyone's questions so far. Again, I am very humbled by everyone's attendance. And remember, if you have people that you would think in your office or friends that would benefit from learning from the webinar, but were unable to attend. Don't worry, as soon as you sign up, you are in our permanent file, and you'll get a recording of this within about a day's time. So I encourage people, look, I know you got a busy day. I know you've been scheduled, but go ahead and register. I also appreciate that we have people listening in their offices during their lunch breaks, etc., where there's more than one, one person will register, play it on their computer for several people at their office, and I truly appreciate that as well. Looks like we are at the end of the questions. So I'll give you back a little bit of time in your day. I, again, appreciate very much you spending 40 minutes of your day. I hope you learned something. If you didn't get a chance to ask a question, please reach out via email. It's greg.horn@partstrader.com. Again, thanks all. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday and a great rest of the week. Thank you.